much to the organisers for inviting me to this charming location. And I'm very glad to be here. And I'm just going to talk about some recent work, all unpublished, that we've been doing trying to study volition in humans. What is volition? Difficult to answer. Somebody recently challenged me to write down what I meant by volition, and I tried to write down some of the key features that a brain state or a mental state would need to have in order to qualify as being related to volition. So volition clearly needs to somehow lead to movement. Philosophers insist that volition is all about being reasons responsive and outcome directed. We've heard from Norm that we want to look at something which is not a response, so no obvious trigger stimulus. Very interestingly, he talked about randomness. People often think about volition as having some innovative or spontaneous quality, and also as perhaps being accompanied by some characteristic subjective experience. The important point about this slide is that all of these mental properties can be directly related to possible brain constraints. So you might expect, for example, that volition ought to be connected to the motor areas of the brain, it should be connected from the reward areas, it should be independent of the sensory areas, and it should be independent of the circuits that drive things like habit and addiction and stereotypy. Okay, so that's just a little philosophical exercise in possible sufficient conditions. What I want to do today is just describe, first of all, some recent work where we've been looking at what might happen in the human brain prior to a volitional action, and then I'm going to look at its relation to subjectivity. So the classical model of intentional action is something we've really inherited from culture. It comes from Haggard, it comes from classical philosophy, and it proposes that we formulate intentions, perhaps through conscious deliberation. This leads to decisions about what we're going to do. There's a period of preparation in the brain, which then leads to our movement. And I'm hoping that I don't need to explain to this audience what the readiness potential is, because I haven't got a slide about it. The readiness potential is a brain activity recorded with electrodes on the scalp over the frontal cortex, which is often interpreted as a readout of this process of pre-action preparation. Sometimes it's thought of as being an internal volitional signal, which is a consequence of the decision to act. And just recently, this whole way of thinking about volitional actions as being the product of conscious decisions elaborated by brain preparation has been blown wide open by this paper by Aaron Schurger, who has suggested that rather than preparation being a direct readout of a single specific internal volitional signal, rather there are particular contexts which make action more or less likely, but the way that we finally act and the moment that we finally act depends just on stochastic fluctuation, depends effectively on random neural noise, so that the time of our action is not driven by an anterior decision, but just by a random neural fluctuation. Now, if you average all of these fluctuations, you'll get something which looks like a readiness potential, and you might think, that is the cause of our action, but, as I understand it, the message of Aaron's paper is, don't be fooled, it's really just noise. So there's this inextricable stochastic element to our action. And if there is a decision, it would be here, not here. That's the key kind of philosophical point, I think, about paper. So, working within that sort of tradition, we tried to develop a new experiment to investigate how people make volitional actions and what brain activity might be associated with it. And we borrowed an experiment developed by Mike Shadland, who's studying monkeys, we're studying humans. And the monkey or the human's task is very, very simple. It's actually a perceptual decision-making task. So we've embedded volition inside a perceptual task, and I'll explain how. The monkey is looking at the screen, and there are dots on the screen, and the dots are initially moving randomly, but after a while, all the dots start to go to the left, in which case the monkey has to respond accordingly, or all the dots start going to the right. So in our experiment, here are the dots moving randomly, and then here are the dots which begin to move coherently to the right and coherently to the left. then you make a response by pressing either a right or a left button. It's really, really easy to make this decision. It's not difficult to see the dots, and you get a lot of money when you get it right. So the only problem is there's a very long and very variable wait before the dots start to move. So you might have to wait between 2 and 200 seconds just watching the screen, waiting for the dots to start to move. It is really, really boring. Really boring. So what we've done is we've allowed people to escape from this unpredictable and boring wait, because while you're waiting for the dots to move, you can, if you like, press both the left and the right keys to skip to the next trial. So we call this a skip response. It brings you a much smaller reward than waiting for the dots to move, but it gets you out of the problem of boring waiting. Now the critical point about the skip response is it's up to you if you do it, and it's up to you when you do it. So it meets the criteria for being a volitional action because it is not a response to an external stimulus, and it is the result of an internal decision. So we can think of this as being in volition embedded within a perceptual decision-making task. It's quite interesting that free will gets reduced to boredom. So we always need a control condition, and the control condition is a completely separate block of trials. In this block of trials, you cannot skip when you want to, but you must skip when you're told. So in this block of trials, you're watching the fixation cross, waiting for the dots to move, and sometimes the fixation cross will turn red, and this means that you must press both keys to skip to the next trial, and you get a small reward. The timing of these instructed skips is exactly the same as the timing of your volitional skips in the previous block. So the temporal expectancy and the temporal dynamics are the same. So the critical point is that here you decide to skip and here you're told to skip, and those are separate conditions of the experiment, separate blocks of the experiment. Now, while we're doing this, we're measuring EEG, and the characteristic thing we're looking for is the readiness potential. So the readiness potential is a very small voltage that you can record from the frontal cortex prior to a voluntary action. And what we've done here is we've shown an average of all of the trials and all of the participants in the self-initiated or volitional skip condition here in red. Now, for those of you who know about EEG, there's a big problem about where do you put your baseline? Where do you think is the place where your activity of interest starts? And we didn't want to make any assumptions about when the readiness potential begins, so we've baselined the data at time 0. So you'll see that the amplitude at time 0, the amplitude is always 0 volts at time 0. And time 0 here, I should say, is the moment that you press both keys to make the skip. So prior to the skip, you'll see this gradual negative going. I should say that we always plot negative up and positive down in EEG, that's just a convention. You'll see this gradual rising negativity prior to the volitional action, which is the classic readiness potential, and when you're just waiting for the fixation cross to change colour because it will tell you to make an externally triggered skip, then you don't see it. I'm not showing you anything here about when the dots actually start to move. I'm not interested in that. I'm only interested in the volitional skips. So the whole dot motion side is really just a distraction to keep the subjects busy. The subjects think they're doing a visual motion experiment. We don't need to tell them anything about free will. Okay, so this just shows that within this embedded volition, we can get this classic marker called the readiness potential. If you look at the individual trials, of which these are the grand averages, what you see is something horrendously noisy because the EEG signal is very small and you need to average many, many trials to see it. But you might already be able to see that the scatter of the red lines, the voluntary skips, is lower than the scatter of the blue lines. And we've tried to capture that by plotting the standard deviation across the 50 or 60 individual skip responses that each participant makes as a function of time. Now remember that we're baseline correcting each individual trial so that it's got a voltage of 0 at time 0. And that's why you get this clear V-shaped picture where the variability of the brain data is always lowest around the time of the baseline correction. It's just an artifact, and gradually increases on either side. Now that's just a technical artifact of what you get when you align and baseline correct any process. It's not really kind of interesting, it's just inevitable. A nice analogy is if you look at 100 people who all get married on the same day, right? Then on the day of their being married, they're probably all really happy. But if you were to ask them 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 days before, you would find that some of them were happy, but some of them were not, right? So whenever you look at any particular aligned process, the variability always increases on either side. So we're not interested in the fact that this curve is V-shaped. What we're interested in is the difference in the convergence between when I voluntarily decide to skip here in red and when I'm told to skip here in blue. So what you can see is that standard deviation of individual trials is lower for self-initiated volitional skips than for externally triggered skips, and there's an extra degree of EEG convergence, which is statistically reliable. We've replicated it a few times. So the point about this, I think, is it's consistent with the idea that prior to the voluntary skip action occurring at time 0, the brain is actually in a particular state, doing a particular thing, and doing it consistently, or relatively consistently, and that's why the variability is low. So variability tends to be low when there's just one thing going on. So this is a relative difference in variability, but it seems to be consistent with the rather classical, perhaps traditional idea that before a voluntary action there really is a precursor process which is relatively fixed and relatively stable, which one might call a putative internal volitional signal. Now, this perhaps is a little bit of a change from theories of randomness, but in fact, working with Aaron Schurger, we've been able to show that a random fluctuation model is completely able to accommodate this data, this idea of a convergence prior to voluntary action, simply by adding one extra term which is that, okay, there is random fluctuation prior to action, but if we imagine some process in the brain which can preparatorily reduce or alter the neural noise, and in particular which could implement a neural noise reduction program, which is represented by this yellow arrow, then that's actually sufficient to produce the readiness potential and the convergence of the EEG. I'm not going to go into the details of the modelling, but I suppose what I want to say is this is the data finding. It looks initially as though it would be consistent with a classical model in which you have intention, preparation, action, but you could actually capture the same data by saying that there's an executive process which takes control of your neural noise prior to a volitional action. And actually maybe that's rather similar to a classical concept of preparation. I want to tell you about a few additional studies that we've recently done using the same method. So here is an exact replication, or pretty much an exact replication of the same data in a different set of people. So once again in red you have the volitional skips, and you see a readiness potential, this rise in negativity, and here are the externally triggered skips in blue, and you don't get it. You see an additional element of convergence, slightly less this time, but still present for the volitional skips in the standard deviation. So this is the first session of the replication experiment. In the second session of the replication experiment, we got the same people to come back into the lab the next day, and we said, okay, it's exactly the same, wait for the dots, skip if you get bored, but you're only allowed half the number of skips you made yesterday. So free will is a rare resource on the second day. It might have a higher economic value. It's certainly perhaps something you might think about more carefully, because you're only allowed to skip boredom half as much, right? And the interesting thing there in this limited skip session, where you've got 50% of the number of skips, is you get even more strongly marked convergence and drop in the standard deviation prior to the moment of the volitional action in the voluntary actions in red compared to the externally triggered actions in blue. So this interaction here is statistically reliable. So the point here is that what we call limited skips, I would say, is a matter of making our actions less habitual, more carefully thought about, more chosen. You're not just going to skip here and now and any old time. You're going to think, well, I've only got 20 skips left in the whole experiment. I've got to manage my boredom landscape over the next hour. I better think really carefully about when I skip. And this leads to a stronger reduction Okay, I'll skip over this. If you make the skip more valuable, then you get a change in the time of the convergence. So what we found is a new operational definition of volition and readiness potentials, which is internally generated and, crucially for philosophy, reasons responsive. And there's a consistent convergence of brain activity before volition action. I just want to tell you about some very recent work that we've been doing, which looks at the relation between brain preparation and conscious experience. So the first experiments that I told you about, there was nothing about consciousness, nothing about subjective reports or are you free or when did you have a conscious experience or anything like that. This is an excellent paper which people ought to read more carefully by Matsuhashi and Haggard, in which you're asked to make an action anytime you feel like it. But if you hear a beep and you were about to make a movement, then don't, right? So you're generating voluntary actions, but if you suddenly hear a beep and you were about to move, then stop. So if you look here at the time of the tones relative to actions, what you see is that about a second and a half before the action, there is a dearth, a lack of tones. And this is the result of the fact that people were sometimes about to move, heard a tone, and then stopped. So the distribution of action relative to tone times has this big gap in it. So the idea here is that this moment T is the moment at which one might become aware that one is about to act if asked. And if you hear a tone after this moment of latent awareness, this feeling that, oh yeah, actually I'm about to move, then you would not act, which leads to this dip in the response. So the idea here is that if you consider a readiness potential, which is some sort of preparatory signal, there might be two different thresholds. The top one is the spontaneous awareness at which you realize, yes, I'm about to press the button now. This would be Livet's W judgment. But lower down, there's another moment which we can call latent awareness, which is where if I were to ask you, hey, are you about to press the button? You would probably say, well, yeah, actually I was. So it's some kind of low-level conscious experience of what we're about to do. So what we've done here is borrowed a paradigm that's been used by John Millen Haynes and others, in which letters are presented very, very briefly on the screen in repetitive serial visual presentation. So these letters are going past, and whenever you feel like it, you press the button, and you're asked to note the letter on the screen at which you first decided to press the button. That will give you an equivalent of the Livet W judgment, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I am going to talk about is that there's an additional instruction. If you see an orange letter, any orange letter like this one, and you're about to move, then move immediately, otherwise don't respond. Right? It's a little bit complicated. You're watching these letters, you're making voluntary actions. If you see an orange letter, please press the button immediately if you're about to move, otherwise don't press the button and carry on as normal. So what this means is that a response coming soon after an orange letter is like a report that I felt I was about to move. Okay? So we've got a behavioural report which indicates, actually, yeah, I feel like moving around now. So what I've shown here is the amplitude of the readiness potential in microvolts as a function of time, locked to the appearance of the orange letter. So these are stimulus locked rather than action locked. And you'll notice that these tracers are really, really noisy, exceptionally noisy. And the reason for that is that there's a visual evoked potential created by the flashing letters, which we can get rid of. So just ignore the noise, it's just due to the flashing letters. What you can see in the orange tracers is the cases where an orange letter was presented and the person responded immediately afterwards. And that means that when the orange letter appeared, they felt they were about to move. And you can see something like a little readiness potential prior to the orange letter. And that's consistent with the idea that there was a readiness potential developing, the orange letter appeared, and they capitalized on their subjective experience of the preparation associated with the readiness potential and pressed the button. But if you look in grey and black at the tracers, these are just different electrodes, where the person saw the orange letter but did not respond, what that means is they saw the orange letter, but because they didn't feel they were about to move at that moment, they just ignored it as instructed. Sorry, it's sentence. Well spotted. Very good. Okay, so what we have then is a distinct and reportable experience of intention prior to spontaneous intention. RP-like signals are largely absent in the absence of an at least latent intention, and RP-like signals are specifically associated with the experience of being about to move. So I think this does something perhaps to restore our idea that the readiness potential is somehow generative of some kind of conscious experience. So just to conclude, there are consistent neural precursors of volitional action. These precursors seem broadly consistent with the functional role of volitional action, I think, in terms of things like deliberation, value, conscious thought, business responsive. Conscious volition is not just retrospectively confabulated post hoc. The reason I put this up is that most people in psychology in the United States think that, quote, conscious free will is an illusion, unquote. But I think the results that I've presented are not consistent with that. Rather, there might be a direct neural readout of precursors. Are these precursors specific to volition? We don't know, possibly in the last experiment. The will may not be free, but I think there is such a thing as a will. I think you can talk about the will. It's a cognitive process and it's potentially accessible to consciousness. Aaron Sherwood and Nima Kalaginajad did the first experiment. Elizabeth Perez did the second. Thanks very much for your attention.
Yeah.
Just if you can go back to the last slide with the latent awareness, there was one great phrase that went with the readiness potential.
Great, well spotted.
I just did the first row, so.
Really, really interesting. So this is the contralateral motor cortex, and the contralateral motor cortex seems to behave differently, and we're struggling to work out why. And my guess, I can only wave my hands, but my guess, well, we know that this precursor activity, which we've shown in the earlier experiment, is related to a drop in the standard deviation. We know that that's not in the motor cortex. We know that that's in the midline frontal. We think it's a cognitive rather than a motor phenomenon. So my guess is that the motor cortex is normally decoupled from executive function, and it just sits there oscillating away, happily, and only when you make a volitional action do the frontal areas kind of lock into the motor cortex and make a chain. So that would explain why the motor cortex is different. It wouldn't explain why the motor cortex shows a stimulus letter-related preparatory activity. So I'm struggling myself to explain that. Very well spotted.
Hans?
What about signals from SMA?
Right, so it's unclear where the readiness potential comes from, but there's one school of thought which suggests that the SMA type areas, the medial frontal cortex in general, is extremely important. So I think every time I've shown a readiness potential, I think there's a strong possibility that it reflects activity in the pre-SMA and SMA complex. We don't, because we record from the surface and because the scalp localization, the source localization is quite poor, I've avoided talking much about brain areas here.
Aaron?
So, Patrick, one thing about the, I mean, if you go back and you had a few slides back, the traces of variance, yeah, or that one, that struck me about this, and also has always struck me about the readiness potential itself, is that it seems to go arbitrarily far back in time.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have a beginning. Whereas if you were talking about some sort of a preparatory process, I think you'd want it to have a beginning. Because, I mean, if it, let's say, for kicks, it goes back 20 seconds, then it starts to be a bit strange.
That's a very good point, and just to take your point in two directions, one would be a technical point, which is we don't know when the readiness potential begins, and because of that, we were careful not to make any assumptions about when it begins, and that's why we baseline corrected at the time of the action itself, so as you know. So I think that makes this analysis relatively safe against your criticism. There's a second part of your comment, which I think is much more conceptual, which is it sensible to talk about a preparation stage, which I've represented here as in the convenient fiction of a sort of fixed box, given that if you like, the causal chain could stretch infinitely far back. And I would say probably this is just a convenient fiction. I think causal chains do stretch infinitely far back, and one can always find a cause for every event. I'm not sure that's necessarily incompatible with what one wants to say about volition. There are several important ideas about the generation of action which involve the basal ganglia loop, the cortex basal ganglia cortex loop, and which emphasize the fact that what we do now is very much dependent on what we did before. So I don't think that necessarily undermines the idea that there are some decisions and that there are some stages of action, but it certainly shows that my box diagram here is just a convenient fiction.
Sorry, we have to stop here. We have a 10-minute break. You're welcome to ask some more questions. So there's some food and so on. Let's